Ukraine last week elected a new president in a landslide vote, Volodymyr Zelensky. What do we know about him so far? Well, other than the fact that he is a Jewish actor and comedian, not much. But put this together with the fact that the Ukrainian prime minister is also Jewish, and now Ukraine is the only country other than Israel where both president and prime minister are filled by Jews. And here to discuss how his election will affect the Ukrainian Jewish community is freelance correspondent and research fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy, Sam Sokol, whose book, Putin's Hybrid War and the Jews, which tells the story of Jewish communities displaced in the current Russo-Ukrainian war, is set to come out later this year. Sam, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So let's jump right in. What do we know about Volodymyr Zelensky? I understand he won in a landslide. What can you tell us?
Well, the first thing that we have to know is that his victory has less to do with support for himself as a person or a candidate as widespread disaffection in Ukraine with the current political elites, both incumbent President Petro Poroshenko, who Zelensky beat, and the other candidates who all represent entrenched interests and dominant oligarchs. Support for Zelensky had less to do with what he said himself. In fact, he had very little of a platform in any traditional sense, very few concrete policy proposals. But what he represented and what he made sure he would represent was a blow against the current political order. And I think that resonated with voters very much.
Mm-hmm. Now, he's identified as Jewish, but you said also that we don't really know much about his platform, but will he address the concerns of the Jewish community in Ukraine? And maybe you can also elaborate on what their main concerns are.
Well, the first thing we have to understand about Zelensky is that he's a politician or a comedian turned politician who is Jewish, not a Jewish politician. He's not acting in a particularly Jewish way. The most significant thing about Zelensky's Jewish identity has less to do with what he would do as a Jew than what it says about the greater Ukrainian society. Because after the 2014 Ukrainian Revolution, when Russia started getting involved in Ukrainian affairs, annexing Crimea, fomenting armed insurgency in the east of the country, a war that continues to this day, one of the larger, most dominant talking points in the Ukrainian propaganda was the fact that Ukraine had become a fascist state. It was dominated by a fascist junta of neo-Nazis who were going to destroy the Jewish community. And this was something the Russians hammered home over and over. And one of the first breaks in that wall of propaganda, one of the first really effective things the Ukrainians had to push back against that false narrative came in 2016 with the ascension of Volodymyr Groysman, a Jew, as the prime minister. Now, fast forward 3 years later, we see a Jewish president being elected. It's less significant in terms of him as a politician, as him as an individual, as what it says about Ukrainian society. Ukrainian society has historically been deeply anti-Semitic and has a history of pogroms. Ukrainian nationalists during the war collaborated with the Nazis and engaged in ethnic cleansing against Jews and Poles. And now to see that not only are the two top spots occupied by Jews, but that their Jewish identities were not an issue in the election, that says a lot. Now, in terms of the Jewish response to Zelensky's election, that's very interesting because on the one hand, in some sectors of the country, members of Jewish communities expressed worry that if he would end up as a bad president or if his administration ends up causing damage,
that it could
because
backfire.
He's a political neophyte, that could indeed cause anti-Semitism. However, the overwhelming reaction from Jewish leaders that I've spoken to across the country is really sort of a collective yawn. There's this feeling that he's, on the Jewish front at least, not going to do that much. Now, we have to look at what the issues are for the Jews in Ukraine. There's two big issues. One is while anti-Semitism in Ukraine in terms of attacks on Jews, violence, things like that, it's relatively low, especially by the standards of Western Europe. Eastern Europe usually has more anti-Semitic rhetoric in the public discourse and much less violence and direct attacks on Jews. So what we're seeing is not any worries about that, but there is a manifestation of anti-Semitism in Ukrainian society, which is Ukraine's national memory policy. Since Since 2015, the Ukrainians have been working very hard to try to create a new historiography that sets them apart from the Russians. And part of that has been trying to rehabilitate national heroes who had fought against the Russians at different points during the 20th century. And a lot of these are people who were involved in pogroms or in the Holocaust or collaborated with the Nazis. So at the same time that you have this government that was promoting Jews and allowing Jews to reach high positions, the irony is this is also a government that's glorifying Holocaust collaborators. At the same time as Groisman was prime minister, in fact, you had a situation where the interior minister, Arsen Avakov, was giving government patronage to far-right militant groups that were acting as vigilante squads, attacking members of the Roma and LGBT minorities in the country. So it's really not a simple narrative, but I think that there is a good chance, even though he's not going to govern as a Jew, per se, or look after Jewish interests as a matter of policy, I think there's a good chance that he's going to help deal with these issues.
Great. Well, Sam, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us about this issue.
Thank you very much for having me.